The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Not through radio. Not through laser pulse or quantum entanglement or any of the 17 detection frameworks the search for extraterrestrial intelligence had maintained, underfunded and half-forgotten, for nearly a century. It arrived through gravity, a precise, rhythmic modulation of local spacetime around Jupiter's fourth Galilean moon, Europa, that no natural phenomenon could have produced. The array at Goldstone picked it up first. Then Parkes. Then the Deep Space Monitoring Station embedded in the permafrost outside Norilsk, Russia, which had been technically decommissioned in 2031 but still reported to 3 separate intelligence services who had never agreed on who owned it. Within 4 hours the signal had been decoded. Not because humanity was clever enough to crack it quickly, but because it had been designed to be cracked. Every layer of the transmission peeled back like a lesson plan. Mathematical constants first. Physical ratios. Then geometry. Then something that looked disturbingly like a star map. Then words. Or rather, concepts. Structured meaning compressed into a format that the translation team at the European Space Agency's Contact Preparedness Division, a real department staffed by 12 people, perpetually awaiting this exact moment, rendered into English over the following 18 hours. You are recognized. Your boundary is acknowledged. A convening of the recognized authorities of this region has been arranged. Your attendance is requested. Coordinates follow. Standard transit time from your primary world, 41 of your days. That was it. No threat. No promise. No cultural context. No indication of who was sending, how many they represented, or what recognized authorities was supposed to mean in a civilization that had 17 functioning governments, for major military alliances, and a United Nations that still argued procedurally over whether it had the authority to respond to extraterrestrial contact on behalf of the species. The UN argued for 9 days. While they argued, the signal was sent to 46 separate intelligence and military analysis offices across 8 nations. Most of them reached the same conclusions independently and in roughly the same order. First conclusion: this was not a first contact. Whatever was on the other end of that transmission had been watching Earth long enough to know its orbital period, its primary language structure, and how to calibrate a gravity modulation device to frequencies that human instruments could detect. They had chosen to make contact. The distinction was important. Second conclusion: the phrase "your boundary is acknowledged" was doing a great deal of work in a very short sentence. A boundary implied a border. A border implied territory. Territory implied that someone had already decided where humanity's space ended and someone else's began, without asking humanity where it thought that line should be. Third conclusion: 41 days was not a generous travel window. It was a test of capability. The coordinates placed the meeting point at a location 17 light-minutes beyond the heliopause, the ragged, wind-torn edge of the solar system's magnetic bubble, where the sun's influence finally surrendered to the interstellar medium. Getting there in 41 days required sustained acceleration that was currently at the outer boundary of what human spacecraft could manage, assuming the vessel in question had been specifically designed for it, had a full crew in rotating hibernation shifts, and suffered no mechanical failures. It was possible. Just barely possible. That was, the analysts agreed, also not an accident. Admiral Yun Seo-yun received the full intelligence package on day 11, aboard the UN Relentless, the United Earth Navy's newest and largest command carrier, which happened to be on deep system exercises near Saturn when the signal arrived. She read it twice. Then she called her senior staff together in the operations center and said 4 words. Show me what's available. The United Earth Navy was not, by galactic standards, an old institution. It was barely 60 years old. It had been assembled from the ashes of 4 separate national space militaries following the Treaty of Geneva's Second Protocol, and its earliest years had been characterized by bureaucratic dysfunction, competing doctrine, and the particular friction that comes from asking soldiers who had spent careers serving flags to suddenly serve a planet. But it had been building ships. Quietly. Seriously. With the focused attention of a civilization that had read enough of its own history to understand that the universe was under no obligation to be friendly. By day 11, Admiral Yun had 3 vessels within viable transit range. The Relentless itself, a command carrier with a crew of 4,000 and enough ordnance to sterilize a small moon. The Gao Xingjian, a frigate-class escort ship running sensor trials near Neptune's orbit. And the Cassandra Osei, a supply and logistics vessel that had been converted, during a retrofit 6 years prior, into something that officially classified as a mobile diplomatic platform, and unofficially classified as whatever the situation required it to be. She submitted her proposal to UN Command on day 12. She requested authorization to take all 3 vessels to the coordinates. UN Command responded that the invitation had requested recognized authorities, which implied a diplomatic delegation, which implied 1 ship, which implied the Cassandra Osei, whose diplomatic platform designation made it the appropriate choice. Admiral Yun filed a formal rebuttal. It ran to 14 pages. It made 3 arguments. The first was strategic, arriving at an unknown rendezvous with a single vessel, in a region of space that the transmitting party had already implicitly claimed knowledge of, was not a diplomatic posture, it was a vulnerability. The second was historical. Every first contact scenario that humanity had modeled over 80 years of academic and military planning had included the variable of capability signaling. You did not walk into a negotiation without demonstrating that you were worth negotiating with. The third was semantic. The invitation had addressed itself to humanity's recognized authorities. The United Earth Navy was a recognized authority. So was its fleet. She did not request permission to be aggressive. She requested permission to be present. On day 19, after 6 more days of procedural debate that consumed 1,700 hours of committee time across 4 continents, UN Command authorized a modified proposal. The Cassandra Osei as primary diplomatic vessel, the Gao Xingjian as escort, and the Relentless as command and communication hub. 3 ships. Not 1. A fleet, by any reasonable definition of the word, even if no one in the UN's press office was using that word yet. Admiral Yun acknowledged the authorization with a single line of response, logged at 0347 hours UTC on the 19th day after first signal. Understood. We will be ready. They had 22 days to reach the edge of everything humanity had ever called home, and whatever was waiting past it. She started the clock. The Relentless crossed the orbit of Neptune on day 7 of the transit, and the universe got quieter. That was how the crew described it later, in the interviews that would eventually be declassified and made public 3 years after the mission concluded. Not silent. The ship's systems hummed constantly, the reactor's low-frequency vibration moved through the hull like a slow heartbeat, and 4,000 people kept the corridors and workstations and mess halls filled with the ordinary noise of human beings doing difficult work in a confined space. But the quality of the quiet changed. The sun, which had been a reference point for every calculation and every instinct since the species first looked up, shrank to a point of light indistinguishable from the background stars. Navigation shifted from solar relative to galactic coordinate framing. The transition was mathematical, not physical. It felt significant anyway. Commander Priya Anand, the Relentless chief science officer and the mission's lead first contact analyst, spent most of the first week in the sensor bay. The ship's long-range detection suite was the most sophisticated array humanity had ever put into space. A combination of gravitational wave interferometers, tachyon-adjacent anomaly detectors whose theoretical basis still generated arguments at physics conferences, and 17 types of electromagnetic receivers covering the full known spectrum. It had been designed, in the optimistic language of its funding proposal, to detect any physical phenomenon of artificial origin within a range sufficient to provide actionable response time. What it was detecting as the fleet crossed beyond the heliopause on day 9 was a great deal more than anyone had prepared for. "They're not at the coordinates," Anand reported to Admiral Yun at 0200 hours on day 9, her voice carrying the careful flatness of someone delivering information they had checked 4 times because they didn't trust the first 3 readings. Yun looked up from the tactical display. "Explain." The coordinates in the transmission placed the meeting point at a fixed location relative to the heliopause boundary. "We've been tracking toward that point since departure. It's approximately 6 hours ahead at current acceleration." Anand pulled up a sensor overlay on the main display. "What the arrays are showing is that there are objects, multiple objects, positioned at 17 separate points distributed around the heliopause. Not at the meeting point. Around it. At distances ranging from 40,000 to 300,000 kilometers from the designated coordinates." The display resolved into a pattern that took Yun's staff several seconds to interpret. When they did, the operations center went quiet in a different way than the quiet of open space. The objects were arranged in a sphere. A rough sphere, asymmetric in a way that suggested practical positioning rather than ceremonial geometry, but a sphere nonetheless. The meeting point, the coordinates from the transmission, sat at the center of that sphere. "How many objects?" Yun asked. "Confirmed distinct signatures, 31. Possible additional signatures in the noise that I'm not prepared to confirm yet. The sensor returns are." Anand paused in a way that communicated more than the pause itself. "They're not returning clean data. The objects are there, mass, displacement, thermal output, all confirming physical presence. But the detailed surface returns are inconsistent. Like the sensors are getting interference from the objects themselves. Stealth systems? Or something that has the same effect without being designed for it? I can't tell which. Yun studied the sphere on the display for a long moment. 31 objects of unknown type, unknown scale, arranged around a meeting point that 3 human ships were currently accelerating toward. The analysts back on Earth had modeled this scenario or something like it. The recommended response in most of the models was to stop, transmit a communication requesting clarification, and wait. She did not stop. What she did was call a full senior staff meeting, present the sensor data without editorial comment, and ask each department head for their assessment. The answers came back over the following 2 hours, and they were not uniform. The tactical officers recommended halting at 50,000 kilometers from the meeting point and requesting identification of the surrounding objects before proceeding. This was the most cautious position and the one most easily defended in a post-mission review. The diplomatic team, 3 people, technically civilians who had been assigned to the Cassandra OSE but were currently conferenced in from 3 separate workstations across the fleet, recommended continuing to the meeting point on the grounds that stopping might be interpreted as either fear or aggression, and that the surrounding objects might be exactly what the transmission had suggested. Other attendees. Anand recommended a middle course. Continue the approach but at reduced acceleration, buying time for the sensors to gather more data and allowing the surrounding objects an opportunity to communicate if they chose to. Yin listened to all of it. Then she made 2 decisions. The first was to reduce acceleration to 60% and extend the approach timeline by 4 hours. This gave the sensor teams more data and gave whatever was out there more time to react to the fleet's arrival in a way that would provide information. The second decision was to activate the relentless, full active sensor array. This was the decision that generated the most discussion afterward. Active sensors, particularly at full power, were not passive observations. They were announcements. 31 objects that had presumably been watching the fleet's approach through their own detection systems would now know with certainty that the fleet knew they were there. The tactical staff argued against it. They preferred the informational advantage of passive observation, the comfort of not revealing how much could be seen. Yun overruled them on a point that she considered more fundamental than tactical advantage. "We are going to a meeting," she said. "We are not going to a hunt. If they have 31 ships positioned around our destination and they wanted to ambush us, we were already inside the ambush when the sensors first picked them up. The question is not whether they know we're here. The question is whether we can demonstrate before we reach that meeting point that we are exactly what we claim to be, a civilization that came here openly with its instruments visible, prepared to talk." She paused. "And one that is paying attention." The active array went live at 1,147 hours. The sensor returns over the following 90 minutes rewrote most of the fleet's working assumptions. The 31 objects were ships. That much the passive sensors had already suggested. But the active returns, fighting through whatever interference the objects produced, began to resolve scale. The smallest was approximately 400 meters in length, roughly comparable to the Relentless itself. The largest measured something the sensor team initially refused to report because the number seemed like an instrument error, then confirmed after 3 independent verification runs. 14 kilometers. One of the ships surrounding the meeting point was 14 kilometers long. Commander Anand brought this finding to Admiral Yun personally rather than sending it through the data relay, which told Yun everything she needed to know about how the science officer felt about it. "Context," Yun said before Anand could begin the presentation. "We don't have direct comparison data," Anand said. "We have no way to know if a 14-kilometer ship represents extraordinary capability or standard configuration for whoever built it. We don't know how old it is, what it's carrying, what it's capable of. Size is not the same as threat." "No," Yun agreed. "It isn't." What she did not say because it did not need to be said in a room full of people who were already thinking it. 3 human ships, the largest of which was just over 400 meters long, were 9 hours away from a meeting point surrounded by 31 vessels of unknown origin, the largest of which was the size of a small city. No one suggested turning back. That, Yun would think later, was the thing worth remembering. Not the tactics, not the sensor data, not the 14-kilometer ship sitting in the dark at the edge of the solar system like a fact that hadn't decided what it meant yet. What was worth remembering was that 4,000 people on 3 ships looked at that data, understood what it implied and kept their posts. The fleet continued its approach. In 6 hours they would find out whether the invitation had been genuine. The prepared response had taken 11 weeks to write. It had passed through the hands of 47 linguists, 12 diplomatic historians, 8 military communication specialists, and a rotating committee of UN representatives who had argued, with the particular determination of people aware they were writing for posterity, over every word. It had been translated into what the contact preparation team believed was a mathematically grounded lingua franca based on the signal's own encoding structure. It had been reviewed, revised, reviewed again, and finally approved by a joint session of the UN Security Council with a vote of 13-2, the two dissenters objecting not to the content but to the font used in the official printed record. Dr. Yusuf Amara, the fleet's chief linguist and the only civilian on the mission with a direct line to Admiral Yun's command channel, read the prepared response for what he calculated was the 42nd time as the Relentless crossed into the final approach corridor, and he felt something he had learned, over a career spent analyzing language for meaning beneath meaning, to take seriously. He felt that it was wrong. Not factually wrong. Not diplomatically wrong. It said what it was supposed to say, that humanity acknowledged the invitation, respected the convening authority, came in peace, sought mutual understanding. All correct. All carefully balanced to project neither weakness nor aggression. 11 weeks of collective intelligence, compressed into 400 words. But language was not just content. Language was posture. And the posture of the prepared response, Amara had come to understand, was the posture of an entity that did not know what room it was walking into. He understood what room it was walking into now. He had studied the sensor data for 6 hours. He had looked at 31 ships arranged in a sphere around a meeting point, at a vessel 14 kilometers long sitting in the dark like a piece of infrastructure, at the precise and patient geometry of an arrangement that had clearly been prepared well in advance of the fleet's arrival. He had thought about the transmission itself, its structure, its economy, the way it had explained only what was necessary to explain and left everything else as a question. And he had revised his assessment of the prepared response. The transmission from the surrounding ships came 17 minutes before the fleet reached the designated meeting point. It arrived on the same gravitational channel as the original signal, which confirmed that whoever was transmitting was either the same party or working in coordination with them. The decoding took 4 minutes. Amara had the render on his screen in the sensor bay within a further 30 seconds, and he sat with it for a moment before sending it to the Admiral. The message was short. You arrived with 3 vessels. The invitation was extended to authorities. We acknowledge the interpretation. State your purpose. Amara read it 3 more times. He noted several things. First, they had not objected to the 3 ships. They had noted it, acknowledged it. The phrase, we acknowledge the interpretation, was doing specific work there, and moved forward. This was either genuine flexibility or a deliberate choice not to make the fleet's first real communication an argument about protocol. Either way, it was a signal. Second, state your purpose, was not a standard diplomatic opener. It was a challenge in the form of a question. It assumed that purpose might require explanation, which in turn assumed that it might not be what it appeared to be. They were asking to be surprised. Or perhaps they were asking to confirm that humanity understood it might need to explain itself. Third, and most importantly, the prepared response did not answer this question. The prepared response said who humanity was and what it hoped for. State your purpose, was asking something different. It was asking what the fleet was doing here, specifically, with 3 ships, at a meeting that had been extended to diplomatic authorities. Amara opened a direct channel to Admiral Yun. I need to recommend against sending the prepared response, he said without preamble, because he had learned that the Admiral responded well to directness. Pause. On what grounds? They've asked us to state our purpose. The prepared response states our identity and our values. Those are not the same thing. He pulled up both texts on the split screen. If we send the prepared response, we are answering a question they did not ask. In most human diplomatic contexts, that signals one of 2 things. Either we did not understand the question or we understood it and chose to answer a different one. And you believe they'll read it the same way. I believe the encoding structure of every message they have sent us has been designed to test comprehension. The original signal was layered, mathematical, then geometric, then conceptual, each layer confirming that the previous one had been understood before providing the next. This message is the same kind of test. They are not asking who we are. They already know who we are. They are asking if we understand what we are doing. Another pause, longer this time. What would you send instead? Amara had been writing it in his head for the past 2 hours. He sent it to her screen. It was 63 words. We are the Naval Command Authority of Earth. We were invited to attend. We came with 3 ships because the question of who we are cannot be separated from the question of what we are capable of. We do not offer the capability as a threat. We offer it as a fact. We believe you are entitled to the facts. We are ready to talk. Yin read it twice. She said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough that Amara began to consider the possibility that he had miscalculated, that honesty of this particular kind was not what the situation required, that 11 weeks of committee work had been right and his 6 hours of personal analysis had been wrong. Send it, she said. The transmission went out at 1,603 hours fleet time. The fleet reached the designated meeting point at 1619. They held position there, 3 ships in the dark, surrounded by 31 vessels of unknown origin, and waited. The response came in 44 minutes. It was longer than any previous communication, a dense block of encoded concept that took Amara and his team nearly 2 hours to fully render. When they did, the translation ran to 6 pages. Amara read all of it. He highlighted 3 passages and sent them to the Admiral with a note that said, "These are the parts that matter." The first passage acknowledged the fleet's response with a phrase that the translation team rendered as accurate representation. The concept embedded in it suggested something closer to, "We confirm that what you showed us matches what you are," a distinction that Amara found significant. The second passage introduced the meeting's context. There were, it explained, 47 recognized civilizations within what it called the regional boundary framework. Of these, 31 had sent representatives to this convening. The remaining 16 had been invited but had declined, for reasons the message did not elaborate on. The convening's purpose was to formally recognize humanity as a new member of the regional framework and to establish the protocols by which Earth's boundaries and rights would be defined. The third passage was the one Amara had marked with 2 lines instead of 1. Your presence with capability was noted. Several of the convened find it unusual. None find it objectionable. One finds it familiar. We will explain when you are ready to receive the explanation. Amara's note to the Admiral read, "The one who finds it familiar is the one I want to know more about. That is either our oldest enemy or our most natural ally. Possibly both." Yun's response came back in under a minute. Agreed. Find out which. In the corridor outside the sensor bay, the fleet's tactical officer was running the 3rd revision of a contact break protocol, a plan for what the fleet would do if the meeting turned hostile. It was good work, thorough and realistic, and Amara knew it was necessary. He also knew, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 30 years studying how beings spoke to each other when they were deciding whether to trust, that they were not going to need it today. Today they were going to talk. What came after talking was a different question entirely. The vein did not look dangerous. That was the first thing Commander Anand noted when the visual feed from the meeting point's designated communication channel resolved into something coherent enough to interpret. The translation team had established a shared visual protocol with the Council's convening authority over the previous 18 hours, a back-and-forth process of encoding standards that had consumed most of the fleet's linguistic staff and produced, as a byproduct, the first genuinely bidirectional communication framework between humanity and an alien civilization. It was, several people noted quietly to each other, probably the most important technical achievement in human history. The weight of that had not quite landed yet. There was too much else demanding attention. The visual feed showed a chamber. Or something that functioned as a chamber, a space enclosed by surfaces that reflected light in patterns suggesting intention rather than accident. The geometry was unfamiliar without being incomprehensible. And in that chamber, distributed across positions that the diplomatic team interpreted as roughly analogous to a conference arrangement, were representatives. The fleet's visual interpretation systems, running models built on human perceptual architecture, doing their best with data they had not been designed for, resolved the representatives into rough shapes. Most were too alien in form to generate useful comparative data. But the vein sat in a position the systems flagged as closest to center, and the vein were, by some measure of convergent evolution that Anand found both fascinating and deeply unsettling, almost bilaterally symmetrical. Almost. They were not human. No one was going to mistake them for human. But the basic arrangement, bilateral symmetry, differentiated sensory cluster at the top, manipulator appendages at the midsection, was close enough to a common template that the human brain, pattern-hungry and evolutionary in its reflexes, reached for comparison before reason could intervene. What the vein had sent, along with the visual protocol, was a data packet. Amara had been working through it for 11 hours when he requested an urgent meeting with Admiral Yun. He arrived in her quarters looking like a man who had found something he wasn't sure he wanted to have found. The vein have been monitoring Earth, he said. He put the data packet summary on her personal display. Not casually. Systematically. The record they've shared with us, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I say shared, because the act of sharing this seems deliberate and I don't want to lose the significance of that, spans approximately 400 years. Yun looked at the summary. What kind of monitoring? Observational. No intervention we can document. No contact attempts. They tracked our technological development, our political structures, our military organization. The data they shared includes what appear to be records of our major conflicts. They have records of both world wars, of the Cold War, of the Geneva Protocol negotiations. He paused. They have records of the UN's founding. They've been watching us build the Navy. Yes. Yun absorbed this. The instinctive response, the one she didn't allow herself to voice, was something between violation and anger. 400 years of surveillance, conducted without consent or acknowledgement, by a civilization humanity had not known existed until 9 days ago. The considered response was different. Why are they telling us now? That, Amara said, is the question I've been sitting with for 11 hours. He pulled up a specific section of the data packet. Buried in the record, and I mean structurally buried, not obviously prominent, is what appears to be an account of their own first contact with the regional framework. The vein did not originate as a member of the council. They were contacted. Approximately 600 years ago by our calendar. And they arrived at their first meeting with ships. He let that sit for a moment. More than 3. Significantly more. Their account of the council's reaction is difficult to translate precisely, but the concept cluster maps to something like, the council was not alarmed. The council took note. And the vein were given a seat at the table that reflected, and this is their phrasing, the scale of what they had brought to the door. The silence in the room had a different quality than the silence of open space. They're telling us, Yun said slowly, that this has happened before. They're telling us that this is how it works. Amara set the display down. The council doesn't invite civilizations to the table and then define their place for them. The council extends an invitation and then observes how the invitation is answered. What you bring to the meeting, how you interpret the invitation, what choices you make about capability and presentation and honesty, that is the data they use to determine how to relate to you. The prepared response, Yun said, would have signaled a civilization that understood the invitation as a test of deference. Arriving with one ship, sending a statement of peaceful values and cooperative intentions, all of which would have been true, would have communicated something specific about how Earth understands its own place in the framework. He paused. What we actually sent and what we actually brought communicated something different. That we know what we are. That we know what we are. And that we chose to be honest about it rather than diplomatic about it. He looked at her steadily. The vein flagged that as familiar because it is what they did. They are telling us, through the act of sharing this history, that they recognize us. Not as an equal yet, the framework has mechanisms and processes for that which we are going to be navigating for years. But as a type of civilization they understand. Yun stood and moved to the viewport. Outside, the stars were fixed and indifferent in the way that stars always were. What type is that? She asked. The kind, Amara said, that doesn't come to the table empty-handed. The debriefing that followed over the next 6 hours was the most strategically consequential conversation the fleet's command staff had ever participated in, which meant it was the most strategically consequential conversation in human history, which was a weight that everyone in the room chose, by unspoken agreement, to deal with later. The immediate questions were practical. The council's formal session was scheduled to begin in 31 hours. The fleet would participate through the communication framework that had been established. Physical presence at the meeting point itself was not required and was logistically not possible given the likely nature of the council's physical convening arrangements. The vein data packet had included, within its deeper layers, something that functioned as a guide to council protocol. Not a complete guide. Enough of one to navigate the opening session without committing an error that could not be corrected. And there was the question of what humanity was being asked to agree to. The regional boundary framework that the council governed was, as best as the translation team could determine, a set of agreements about territory, resource access, conflict resolution, and something that translated roughly as traffic, the movement of vessels between systems. Joining the framework meant accepting its terms. The data packet had not included those terms in full, which was either an oversight, a test, or a deliberate choice to conduct that negotiation in session rather than in advance. Yun suspected it was the third option. What leverage do we have? Asked Captain Hiroshi Takeda of the Gao Xingjian, who had been the tactical voice in every briefing and whose instincts Yun trusted precisely because they were different from her own. The usual kind, Yun said. We're here. We came when asked. We came honestly. We demonstrated that we are worth talking to without making the demonstration a threat. That's not nothing. It's not a treaty position. No. But it's a reputation. And reputation, she said, is where every treaty position starts. In 31 hours, she was going to walk humanity into its first formal engagement with a galactic community that had been functioning for longer than recorded human civilization. She spent 20 of those hours in the operations center, reviewing every piece of data the fleet had gathered, and 10 of them sleeping, because decisions made on inadequate rest were a liability she could not afford. When she woke, there was a new message from the vein. It was short. We would speak with you before the session. Privately, if that concept translates. There is history that belongs to you that the Council does not yet know we have shared. Amara's note at the bottom of the translation read, I think they're asking to be our allies. I also think they're warning us about something.
The private channel took 3 hours to establish. Not because of technical difficulty. The communication framework was by now well tested, but because private required definition. In a council session surrounded by 31 other civilizations, each with detection and intelligence capabilities that humanity could not fully assess, the concept of a conversation that could not be observed was either naive or impossible or both. The vein, when this concern was relayed, responded with a phrase the translation team rendered as private enough, a concept implying that what mattered was not absolute secrecy, but the absence of official record within the Council's formal communication archive. They were asking to speak off the record. That was a recognizable idea. The channel opened at 0340 hours, fleet time. Amara handled the communication himself, with Admiral Yun beside him, and a recording running that would never leave the fleet's internal servers. The vein representative, it was impossible to tell from the visual feed whether this was the same individual who had appeared in the council chamber or a different one, transmitted a long, layered communication that took Amara 40 minutes to fully unpack while the Admiral waited. When he finished, he set his notes down and said, There are 3 things. Tell me all of them. The first is informational. The Vane's record of Earth, the 400 years of surveillance data they shared with us, was not a unilateral decision. They obtained sanction for it from the Council, specifically from the Council's Contact Preparation Committee, 60 years ago, when the UN was founded. Yun processed this. The Council knew we were building a navy. The Council knew, 60 years ago, that we were organizing our space capabilities into something that looked like a military institution. At that point, the Council made a decision. They assigned the Vane to maintain monitoring and to bring the contact question forward when a specific threshold was reached. What threshold? Amara found the relevant section of his notes. The translation is imprecise, but the concept cluster maps to when the observed civilization demonstrates the capability for independent interstellar transit. Not just orbital capacity. Not just solar system navigation. When they can, under their own power, leave their home system and reach a specific destination within a defined time window.
He paused.
The 41-day window in the original invitation was not selected arbitrarily. It was set at approximately the outer limit of what the monitoring data suggested we could achieve. The operations center was very quiet. They designed the test around our maximum capability, Yun said. They designed the invitation around our maximum capability. The test is in how we answered it. Yun looked at the display for a long moment. 60 years. The UN had been born into a surveillance program it had never known about, its development tracked and assessed by a civilization it couldn't see, its readiness for contact evaluated against criteria it hadn't been told existed. The anger that response produced was real, and she acknowledged it to herself, and then she set it aside because anger was not a tool she could use here. The second thing, she said. The second thing is a warning. Amara's voice shifted slightly, not in tone, but in precision, the way it did when he was choosing words carefully. Of the 31 civilizations represented in this session, the Vane have flagged 3 as what they describe as boundary-pressuring entities. The translation is approximate, but the concept is clear. These are civilizations that have, within the framework, consistently sought to maximize the constraints placed on newly joined members. to define newcomers' territorial rights as narrowly as possible, to establish precedents that limit their capacity to expand. They want small neighbors, Captain Takeda said, from across the room. They want neighbors they can manage, Amara said. The distinction matters because it implies something about motivation. These are not aggressive civilizations in the sense of seeking open conflict. They work through process, through framework rules and treaty language and the establishment of precedent. The concern of Vane are flagging is not that these three will threaten the fleet. The concern is that the formal session will produce a treaty in which Earth's boundaries are defined so narrowly and Earth's expansion rights so tightly constrained that humanity's long-term position in the framework is compromised before we fully understand what we've agreed to.
This was the kind of threat that Yun's tactical staff had not modeled. It required a different vocabulary. And the third thing, she asked? Amara was quiet for a moment. The third thing is what the Vane want in exchange for the warning. He had not phrased it that way in his preliminary notes. He had used softer language, more diplomatic framing. But when he looked at the Admiral, he found he didn't want to soften it. They want an association. Not a formal treaty that would require council disclosure and create complications they've apparently been navigating around for some time. They want a standing communication channel. Informal. Deniable technically. They want to know what Earth is doing and thinking as we navigate the framework's early years, and they want us to know the same about them. Why? Yun asked. Because, Amara said, they were exactly where we are 600 years ago. And the alliances they built in their first years in the framework determined everything that came afterward. They learned this the hard way. They are, as best I can interpret the emotional register of their communication, offering to help us not learn it the same way. The silence that followed lasted almost a minute. Takeda spoke first. Could be manipulation. They establish a trust relationship now, use it later. Yes, Amara agreed. Could also be exactly what it looks like, said Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, the fleet's senior intelligence officer, who had been quiet through most of the briefing and whose silence, in Yun's experience, usually meant she was building a complete picture before offering it. A civilization that's been in this framework for 600 years and has spent the last 60 monitoring us closely enough to calibrate an invitation to our exact capability limit. They've invested in us. That's not nothing. That's not the behavior of something that sees us as a short-term asset. What's their position in the council? Yun asked Amara. Third oldest member still actively represented. Significant influence on framework rules by longevity if not always by direct vote. The three boundary-pressuring civilizations are all more recent members, within the last 200 years, and have, according to the data record, been in recurring procedural conflict with the Vane over exactly the kinds of expansion rights questions that will affect Earth. Yun stood. The calculation was not simple and she did not pretend it was. Accepting the Vane's offer meant entering an informal alliance before the formal session began, with a civilization they had known for 11 days, based on information they could not independently verify, in exchange for strategic guidance they desperately needed. It was, by any standard diplomatic analysis, premature. But diplomacy, like tactics, operated on the information available. And the information available said that in 28 hours humanity was going to sit, metaphorically, across a communication framework, at a table of 47 civilizations, 3 of which had specific incentives to minimize Earth's long-term position, and that the framework rules produced in that session would shape human expansion for decades. The Vane were offering to help navigate that, in exchange for a relationship. Send this response, Yun said to Amara. Tell them we understand what they've shared and we appreciate the clarity of it. Tell them we are prepared to maintain the communication channel they've described. And tell them we would welcome their guidance on the 3 they've flagged. Specifically, what kinds of framework language to watch for and what alternatives are available within the treaty structure. She paused. And tell them one more thing. Tell them we're aware this relationship requires trust, and that we understand trust is built over time rather than declared. We're not asking them to trust us completely. We're asking them to trust us enough to start. Amara sent it. The response from the Vane came back in 7 minutes. It was 2 words in the concept encoding format they'd established. And when Amara rendered them into English, he looked at the translation for a moment before he read it aloud. Sufficient start. The formal session of the Galactic Regional Council, that was not its name, which was untranslatable in any compact form, but it was how the fleet staff had been referring to it and the usage had stuck, began at 0900 hours fleet time on day 26 of the transit. The fleet held position at the meeting point coordinates. The 31 surrounding vessels had not moved in the 37 hours since arrival. The communication framework, now well established and capable of handling simultaneous multi-party encoding, opened across every ship in the fleet simultaneously. Yun took the session from the operations center of the Relentless, with Amara on her left handling translation in real time, Vasquez on her right monitoring the intelligence overlay, and the rest of her senior staff distributed across stations throughout the room. The session's opening came from the convening authority, a civilization the Vane had identified as the Council's longest-standing active member, which the translation team had taken to calling the Archivists because their encoding structure carried within it a pervasive sense of collected history. The Archivist's opening statement was ceremonial in function if not in tone. It named the session, identified its purpose, established which framework rules governed its conduct, and acknowledged the parties present. When it named humanity, it used a phrase that Amara translated in real time as, the new voice. He wrote a note in the margin of his translation log. Not a dismissal. This appears to be the standard designation for civilizations in their first formal session. The Vane were apparently called this once. The emotional register is neutral. The session's first working item was territorial definition. This was where the Vane's warning became immediately relevant. The proposal on the table, submitted, the session materials indicated, by one of the three flagged civilizations, a species the fleet's intelligence team had taken to calling the Formulists because their encoding was dense with procedural precision, defined Earth's territorial boundary as a sphere with a radius of 1 light-year centered on Sol. 1 light-year. The nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, was 4.2 light-years away. The proposal, framed in careful framework language as a standard provisional boundary for newly recognized civilizations, would place everything beyond 1 light-year outside Earth's protected territory, available under framework rules for claim and development by existing member civilizations, for a provisional period of 50 years, after which a boundary review could be requested. 50 years. With a review that could be requested but not guaranteed. Amara's handwriting in the margin was smaller than usual and very precise. This is what the Vane warned about. Standard language. Not illegal within the framework. The trap is in accepting it as standard. Yun read the note and looked up. What's the alternative? She asked quietly enough that only Amara could hear. He had spent the previous 26 hours with the Vane's guidance preparing for this. The framework has a second boundary definition mechanism, he said. Less commonly invoked. It applies when the newly recognized civilization can demonstrate what the framework calls active presence in a zone, meaning they have, at the time of the session, assets physically operating within that zone. The active presence mechanism sets the boundary at the edge of demonstrated activity rather than at an arbitrary fixed radius. And we have ships at the heliopause, Yun said. We have 3 ships at the heliopause, which is, depending on how you calculate it, between 120 and 130 astronomical units from Sol. About twice the distance of Neptune. Not a light-year. But well beyond the 1 light-year proposal in one critical direction. The heliopause is the boundary. If we invoke the active presence mechanism, we are asserting that the boundary of Earth's protected territory follows the edge of demonstrated human presence, which currently includes this fleet. He paused. The Vane have indicated this will be contested. The Formulists and their allied civilizations will argue that 3 military vessels on a diplomatic mission do not constitute the kind of active presence the mechanism was designed to recognize. They're not wrong technically. This will be a debate. Good, Yun said. I know how to have debates. She straightened in her chair, composed herself with the specific stillness she used when she needed to think and needed to look calm while thinking, and then she transmitted a formal objection to the proposed boundary definition. The objection cited the active presence mechanism by its framework designation, a reference Amara had prepared phonetically for her transmission, and asserted that Earth's current demonstrated presence extended to the heliopause, where 3 vessels representing the naval authority of Earth were, at this moment, actively operating. The session paused. In human terms, it went quiet. 31 civilizations processing an objection from a species that had been formally recognized for approximately 47 minutes. The response from the Formulists came in 12 minutes. It was precisely what Amara had predicted. The 3 ships were present for diplomatic purposes, not for operational presence, and the active presence mechanism applied to sustained operational activity, not a single transit. Yun's response had been prepared. Earth's naval operations in the outer solar system, she transmitted, were not limited to this mission. She attached, with the transmission, a summary of the United Earth Navy's Deep System exercise schedule for the preceding 6 years, The exercises that had brought the Relentless to Saturn's vicinity when the signal arrived. Regular, sustained, documented operational activity across the solar system and beyond. The current fleet position was not an anomaly. It was an extension of ongoing operations. The active presence mechanism did not require permanent habitation. It required demonstrated regular use. Another pause. Longer this time. The Vane transmitted something on the private channel during the pause. Amara read it, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. They say, he told Yun, that the formulists were not expecting that. Nobody expects documentation, Takeda said from across the room. It got a quiet laugh from the staff, which was the best thing that could have happened at that moment. The tension in the operations center had been accumulating for hours, and a laugh, however brief, was oxygen. The formal council deliberation on the boundary question took 4 hours. The Vane spoke in support of the active presence argument, carefully, with the measured authority of 6 centuries in the framework. 2 other civilizations, ones the fleet's intelligence team had not flagged as either allies or adversaries but who apparently had their own reasons for not wanting precedents set by the formulist proposal, also spoke in support. The vote was not unanimous. It was not expected to be. But when the result was transmitted, the boundary definition that passed was not the formulist's 1 light-year proposal. It was the active presence mechanism. Earth's protected territory, under the framework that the Council had just formally adopted, extended to the operational boundary of demonstrated human activity, which meant, in practical terms, that as the UEN expanded its operational range, the protected boundary moved with it. It was not a perfect outcome. The 50-year review mechanism was still incorporated, and the language around what counted as sustained operational activity would require constant maintenance and documentation. There were 3 more working items in the session, covering resource access rights, conflict resolution protocols, and something called transit registration, that would take the fleet's legal staff months to fully interpret. But the first and most consequential item had not gone the way the formulists intended. In the margin of his translation log, Amara wrote, "The Vane were right. This is how it works. Not force. Framework." After the session concluded, 6 hours and 20 minutes after it began, Yun received a private message from the Vane. It was 3 words. "You learn quickly." She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Amara with a single question. "Is that a compliment?" His response came back in under a minute. In their encoding structure, quickly carries a sense of relative to how long we expected it would take. So yes, conditionally. With a 600-year reference frame, quickly covers a lot of ground. She saved the message. She would include it in the mission report, flagged as significant. On day 26 of a mission that no one had expected to look like this, humanity had its first treaty. It was imperfect. It was a beginning. Tomorrow the hard work of understanding what they had agreed to could start. The Relentless crossed Neptune's orbit on the inbound leg without ceremony. The crew noted it anyway. Someone had marked the calendar in the mess hall, a printed paper calendar, which was technically a violation of the ship's paperless materials protocol and which Yun had been informed about and chosen not to act on. The notation read, Day 41. Welcome back. Several dozen people added their signatures around it over the following 12 hours. Day 41. The number from the invitation. The time window that had been calibrated to their maximum capability. They had made it there and they were making it back, which was not a small thing to be grateful for, even if the gratitude was quiet and mostly unspoken. The transit home was different from the transit out. Not in its mechanics. The same drives, the same schedules, the same watch rotations and meal cycles and maintenance checklists. Different in its atmosphere. The outbound leg had been charged with the specific tension of approaching an unknown. The return leg carried a different weight. The weight of having been somewhere and done something whose full consequences were not yet visible. Yun spent the transit writing. This was not typical for her. She was a commander who communicated in briefings and orders and the precise economy of operational language. But the mission report for an event of this scale required something more than operational summary, and she had decided, as a matter of professional discipline rather than personal inclination, to produce a document that captured not just what had happened but why the decisions had been made as they were. The report ran to 340 pages. The intelligence summary attached to it ran to another 200. The Vane data packet, translated and annotated by Amara's team, was a further 800 pages and would occupy academic and intelligence analysis for years. The communication logs, session recordings, sensor data, and treaty text were separately archived. What Yun captured in the report itself was the framework for understanding what humanity had just walked into. The regional framework, she wrote, was not a government. It was not an alliance. It was closer, in human political terms, to an international treaty organization, the sort of institution that operated through shared rules and mutual interest rather than centralized authority. Its power lay in the collective willingness of its members to abide by its protocols and to enforce those protocols on each other. Civilizations that violated framework rules faced economic and spatial consequences administered through the collective, not through any single enforcing power. This made it, in her assessment, both more manageable and more complex than a government. More manageable because there was no single alien authority that humanity needed to satisfy or appease. More complex because the framework's rules were the product of 600 years of accumulated negotiation between 47 civilizations with 47 different sets of interests, and understanding those rules well enough to navigate them strategically would take time that Earth could not fully afford to spend on learning before it started acting. The boundary definition that the session had adopted was the most immediately consequential outcome. Earth's protected territory would grow with demonstrated operational presence, which meant the United Earth Navy's expansion schedule had become, overnight, a geopolitical document. Every new patrol route, every deep system exercise, every mission beyond the heliopause would be establishing and maintaining territorial claims in a legal framework that had teeth. This was not a comfortable thought. It placed the Navy in a role that was simultaneously military, diplomatic, and cartographic. Yun noted in her report that she expected this to generate significant debate in the UN Security Council, the UN's command authority, and every academic institution that studied international, now interstellar, relations. She also noted that the alternative was worse. The formulist's one light-year proposal would have constrained Earth's expansion for decades and established a precedent that subsequent boundary reviews would have struggled to overcome. The active presence mechanism, as the Vane had explained and experience had confirmed, was the framework's built-in accommodation for civilizations that arrived at the table with capability. It was designed to be used. The civilizations that had not used it in their first sessions had spent generations trying to renegotiate the consequences. The Vane's role in the mission was the section of the report that Yun found most difficult to write. She wrote 3 versions of it. The first was too guarded. It described the Vane as a potential strategic partner, in language so hedged as to be meaningless. The second was too effusive. It characterized their assistance as generous and trustworthy in a way that overstated what the fleet actually knew. The third, which she submitted, tried to be honest about the uncertainty without letting the uncertainty become an excuse for inaction. The Vane had provided information that proved accurate. They had provided guidance that proved useful. Their stated motivation, recognition of a familiar pattern, the desire to smooth a process they had navigated difficultly themselves, was consistent with their behavior, though not provable from a single 41-day interaction. They wanted a communication channel. The fleet had agreed to maintain one. This was, Yun wrote, a reasonable agreement with an entity whose interests appeared to partially align with Earth's, contingent on continued observation and assessment. She noted, in a separate classified annex, that the Vane's 40 years of surveillance data was the single most significant intelligence asset the mission had produced and that its analysis should be treated as the highest priority for Earth's contact research community. Understanding how the Vane had read Earth's development, what they had considered significant, what thresholds had triggered which responses, would tell humanity more about how the framework as a whole understood human civilization than any single diplomatic interaction could. Amara contributed a supplementary section on the communication framework itself, which was modest in its claims and extraordinary in its implications. The bidirectional encoding system established during the mission was imperfect, imprecise, and prone to conceptual gaps that were sometimes bridged by intuition and sometimes simply left as acknowledged uncertainties. It was the best first-contact linguistic tool humanity had ever produced. It would need to be rebuilt, refined, and professionalized over years of ongoing contact. He recommended the immediate establishment of a dedicated interstellar linguistics institute with appropriate funding and legal authority to maintain and develop the framework. He also appended a personal note, separate from the formal report, addressed to Yun. In all of this, he wrote, "I keep returning to the moment you decided not to send the prepared response. The committee worked for 11 weeks on those 400 words. They were good words. They were honest words. They were the wrong words at the right moment, and you understood that because you understood what the question actually was. I've spent my career studying how communication works between parties who don't share a language or a culture. The core problem is always the same, not translation but comprehension of intent. The Vane weren't asking who we were. They were asking if we knew what we were doing. The prepared response answered a question about identity. Your 63 words answered a question about self-awareness. I don't know if that distinction will matter in 50 years. I don't know if the alliance with the Vane will hold or the boundary will be contested or the framework will turn out to be something different than it appears to be. What I know is that on day 9 of this mission we were asked if we understood what we were doing and we said yes and we meant it and it was true. That's a better start than most. Yun read the note twice. She kept it in the same file as the Vane's sufficient start. The fleet arrived in Earth orbit on day 41 of the return leg, 82 days after departure. The docking process at the UEN orbital station was routine. The crew rotation and rest scheduling was routine. The medical screenings were routine. The press conference was not routine because nothing of this scale could be routine, but Yun had been given 7 hours of preparation time and she used all of them. She stood at the podium in the station's media center with 4,000 journalists connected via satellite and answered questions for 3 hours. She was honest about what had been accomplished and honest about what was uncertain. She described the framework without overstating its benefits or understating its complexities. She declined to characterize the Vane relationship in terms stronger than the evidence supported. She acknowledged, when directly asked, that arriving with 3 ships instead of 1 had been a deliberate choice, that she stood by it, and that she was aware it would be debated. When a journalist asked whether humanity was now safe, whether membership in the framework meant protection from the unknown, she paused before answering, which was a pause that ended up being the clip that played most widely in the coverage that followed. Membership in the framework means we are known, she said. It means our existence is formally acknowledged and our territory has a legal definition that other civilizations have agreed to respect. Safety is a different question. Safety is what we build from that starting point over time, through the same combination of demonstrated capability, credible diplomacy, and sustained attention that got us to the meeting point in the first place. She looked directly at the camera. We went to the edge of our solar system with 3 ships because we understood that you cannot ask to be taken seriously if you are not prepared to demonstrate what being serious looks like. We are not gods. We are not the strongest civilization in that framework. We are the newest, and being new means we have the most to learn and the least room for carelessness. She paused. But we were there. We answered the invitation. We were honest about what we brought and why we brought it, and we were taken seriously because of it. That's the work. That's what continues now. 3 months later, the UN Security Council approved the establishment of the Interstellar Relations Directorate, the expansion of the UEN's Deep System Operational Mandate, and the funding for the first dedicated interstellar linguistics program at the University of Geneva. 6 months later, the first communication through the ongoing Vane channel arrived. A lengthy data packet covering framework procedural updates and a brief personal note that Amara rendered as, "The formulists have filed 3 procedural objections to your boundary definition. All 3 are within framework rules. All 3 will fail. We wanted you to know before the formal notification arrives." It arrived 4 days before the formal notification. Yun forwarded it to the Interstellar Relations Directorate with a single comment. "This is what an alliance looks like when it's working." The formal notification, when it came, was handled by the new directorate's legal team. They had, in 4 months, already become expert in framework procedural language. They filed counter-responses within hours. The objections failed as predicted. Humanity was in the framework. The framework was real. And the work of being in it, careful, serious, sustained, unglamorous work, had already begun. In the UEN's operational logs, the mission was recorded under its formal designation. But among the fleet's crew and eventually in the service's informal culture, it was called something simpler. The demonstration. Not because humanity had set out to demonstrate anything, but because, in the end, everything they had done, the 3 ships, the honest 63 words, the active presence claim, the documentation, the Vane relationship, had demonstrated the same thing. That they understood what they were. That they had come prepared to be exactly that. And that they intended to keep showing up.